convention of states, people, right? I talked about this a few weeks ago, how I'm a little bit concerned about this whole thing because of who's backing it. You know, it's basically being headed up by Mark Meckler, the guy who people say he was the founder of the Tea Party movement. He used to be the head of it, and so on. He's actually spearheading this Convention of States movement, and we talked about it because I'm looking at who's backing this thing. The Convention of States movement the Convention of States is from Article 5 of the Constitution, which allows for a Convention of States. If you get enough states involved, you can have a Convention of States, which allows you to essentially rewrite the Constitution, put amendments in there, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And so we got this Convention of States movement happening. Many people are backing this, but when we look at the list of people backing it, we take a look at it and we go, wait a minute. This is all like Mark Levin and Glenn Beck and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. Actually, I'm looking at the Convention of States website. Bobby Jindal, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz.
Hey, you're scaring me, brother. You're scaring me. I'm not going to steal your thunder, but the names you just listed, so go ahead. Keep talking.
Well, you can imagine why all these guys want a Convention of States. They want to clear up some language, right? like natural-born citizen. There's been so much debate and contention over what natural-born citizen means. Now we have the official, I guess, unofficial mouthpieces for this movement are Mark Levin and Glenn Beck, who were rabid Ted Cruz supporters, and they would. I mean, there was all this talk about this, and then Glenn Beck was a Ted Cruz supporter, obviously, and Mark Meckler was a Rubio supporter. And so here we have all these guys who basically they had large portions of the country against them because, you know, Ted Cruz has a Canadian birth certificate. He was born in Calgary, Alberta.
My
and
gosh.
he's running for president of the United States.
And Marco and Jindal had Indian parents. Marco had Cuban parents. None of them had citizenship when these guys were born. I mean, this is so ridiculous. I mean, it's like they're covering for Barack Obama.
Right. And so when we exposed all of this, the last time we talked about this, my email inbox blew up with people who were sufficiently angry. I mean, these people were angry at what we were exposing about this because initially they were on board with the whole thing, and they're like, wait a minute, what's the agenda here? And why is it that we have to have a Convention of States to amend the Constitution when we drifted so far away from the original document? We talked about the Second Amendment and how there are no limits on the Second Amendment. In fact, the Second Amendment prohibits limiting the rights of Americans to keep and bear arms. And yet, Americans have allowed limits to be placed on their right to keep and bear arms to the point where you can barely get a gun anymore without going through so many hoops and background checks. And I mean, we talked about in the old days when kids used to be allowed to keep and bear arms because the Constitution said they could, and the American people relied on good parenting to decide if their kids were mature enough to handle a gun. They made sure their children could sufficiently take care of a weapon, keep it properly maintained, and how to properly use a weapon when hunting or defending your domicile. Right?
Yes. Let me weigh in on that very quickly to back up what you just said. We've told this story here before, but I grew up in the United States of America. When I was in high school, JC, I want you to look at me. JC's a young man in his 20s, and I've known him since he was a baby boy, but he's a man now, pure D man. But this is going to freak you out, JC, what Mike and I are talking about. When I was in high school in the Gulf Coast, Northwest Florida, I would go to school during the fall and hunting season with a 16-gauge Browning Sweet 16 shotgun laying in the back seat of my car. And, of course, I would lock the car because I didn't want somebody stealing the gun. That was it. And the principal used to come out when he knew that we were into hunting season. He would come out and he would lust over that gun. He loved that gun. He would look at the gun and we'd pull it out and we'd talk about it and he'd, rack it and everything right there in the parking lot. The principal and I in the parking lot of the high school with a 16-gauge shotgun, Mike Shoesmith. And then after school, my best friends and I, we would get together. We'd go to the dove fields and wherever we were hunting. And we would take the guns that we had brought to school with us that day. We had a parking lot full of shotguns in our cars, and all during my high school years, no one ever threatened to go to their. There was never a shooting. No one pulled out a knife. Nobody threatened to go to the car and get the shotgun and shoot up the school. I mean, we're living in different times. Something spiritual has happened, Mike. Go ahead.
And people were very angry, not at us, but they were angry at this movement and what it entails, and perhaps the motives behind it, to these people who want a Ted Cruz as president to get in there and finagle the language so that it would back a president who wasn't even born in the country, born in Canada. I mean, the whole thing really does stink. But as angry as those people were, they're about to get outraged because I don't have permission to use this person's name. This person sends me a lot of information, important, and which deals with this sort of thing. You won't believe who else is backing the Convention of States. This person, the person who wrote the book, her name is Orlean Cole. She's author of America Needs Revival, Not Revision, Dangers and Threats of an Article 5 Convention, okay? She writes in this article, now I had this sent to me through Constant Contact. I don't know where people can find this article. I can link to Constant Contact on the Freedom Friday Facebook page, and that will take people to this article. And by the way, I have vetted what this person says in this article, and it all lines up. It's all true.
Wow. Okay.
She starts the article with, conservative Mark Meckler has developed a working relationship with two far-left leaders who also want an Article 5 convention. They are Joan Blades, co-founder of the far-left MoveOn.org. Hello? I mean, everybody knows who they are by now.
Yep.
And one of the prominent groups that are part of Move to Amend, funded by George Soros. George Soros is funding a movement to launch a Convention of States Article 5 convention.
Okay, you've sold me. We can stop this whole interview right now and go on to something next. I am against the Convention of States.
Well,
no, I'm kidding you. Please keep educating us because, see, I did not know a lot of this stuff that you're telling us, especially who's involved. So George Soros is deeply involved with this. Keep going, Mike. Keep going. I interrupted you.
My research shows that George Soros is funding the majority of this because Move to Amend is a figurehead nom de plume of a much larger group, which includes hundreds of minor groups who are backing this Convention of States, Article 5 Convention. Okay, but the other leader is Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig. Both leftist groups want an Article 5 convention because their desire to overturn the Supreme Court ruling of Citizens United. And more on that in a second, but Lessig just happens to believe the Constitution needs to be totally rewritten. So people who think that an Article 5 convention is just all about, tweaking language and removing government interference into your personal lives, that's already enshrined in the Constitution. We don't need amendments we just need to go back to the Constitution, right? But this guy Lessig, who is one of the leaders of this movement from the left, wants it totally rewritten. Joan Blades, I'm looking at a picture here, actually, of Joan Blades, one of the founders of MoveOn.org, arm in arm with Mark Meckler. It's a shocking picture. And this picture was taken in her Berkeley apartment for a photo shoot that was part of an article in the San Francisco Chronicle. I did look up that article. That article does exist. And that was from January 2013. It was part of a living room conversation that Blade created in hopes to bring common ground on issues on both sides of the spectrum. So Mark Meckler is now a national spokesperson for the Convention of States, one of many different groups, all pushing for an Article 5 convention. And this Joan Blades character, she is one of the founders of MoveOn.org, which is funded by George Soros. And now here's the thing. MoveOn.org is one of 700 far-left groups who are all part of Move to Amend. So Move to Amend is sort of like the head name of the 700 far-left groups. It's like a national coalition kind of thing, and they all want Article 5 to take place for very different reasons, and George Soros is the big funder of both MoveOn.org and move to amend.
That's amazing. Mike, we've got to take a time out. The music's getting ready to start. We've got to go to break. I think you've given us a tremendous education. Thank you for the work that you've done on it. And if, being true to Freedom Friday, if you find out that there's something else to it, or maybe you or I were incorrect in any of this, we'll get it right. But for right now, this does not sound like a really good idea, does it?
No, and I'm putting that article, that Constant Contact article, up on the Freedom Friday with Carl Gallups Facebook page, just so people can do their own research.
Okay, good deal. We'll be right back after this time out, folks. Don't go anywhere.